You probably know Dortmund as the team who have made their name as finding the next talent in football, buying them low and then selling them on for a high price. Ousmane Dembele, Jude Bellingham, Erling Haaland. It wasn't always like this though. Dortmund actually used to buy top tier players that were the finished product until it ended up putting the existence of the club at risk. So here is how Dortmund nearly went bust. In the 90s, the Bundesliga was a wild place. Bayern were in their FC Hollywood era, and you had clubs like Stuttgart, Werder Bremen and Kaiserslautern winning the league, while Frankfurt came close. But Dortmund were one of the most successful teams in this decade. But at the start of it, they hadn't even won the Bundesliga. So heading into the 90s, Dortmund had won the top tier of German football before, but that was before the Bundesliga was created. After the Bundesliga was created, they did not win it until 1994. And so to try and fix this drought of the Bundesliga, they ended up hiring a Swiss head coach called Ottmar Hitzfeld, and he had an immediate success and led the team to second in the table. And the only reason they didn't win the title was because Stuttgart scored a late winner. However, as they finished second, they qualified for the UEFA Cup. And then that year, Dortmund would invest in Matthias Sammer and Stefan Reuter, two key players in the years to come. A year later, they were on a run to reach the final of the UEFA Cup before losing to Juventus 6-1. But this run in the cup gave Dortmund at the time over 25 million mark, which they would begin to invest heavily in their squad. Now, the use of fees is going to get very complicated. It's going to switch from marks to euros to pounds all over because it's very hard to find equivalent fees. So at the time, Dortmund were obviously without major success. And so their heads at the time, Gerhard Niebauer and Michael Meyer, who will become very important soon, decided, okay, we're going to start investing heavily and make ourselves one of the best teams in not only Germany, but the world as well. And especially with Bayern struggling, Dortmund smelt blood. And so they took the chance to try and become the top dog in German football. And what they started to do was bring German players back from Italy. So at the end of the 80s and the early 90s, several top German players moved to Italy due to the higher salary that they would get and the lower tax they would have to pay on it. And so previously at Inter, for example, you had the likes of Lothar Matthäus, Jürgen Klinsmann and Andreas Bremer. While in the 90s, Andreas Müller, Jürgen Köhler and Reuter all played for Juventus. So it was a big coup from Dortmund when they brought Matthias Sammer back to Germany for 4.9 million euros, which was a lot of money at the time. And they continued this trend after the UEFA Cup run as they signed Karl-Heinz Riedel from Lazio, and then in 1994, Müller would join Dortmund from Juventus alongside his teammate Julio César. And so in 1995, Dortmund will win the Bundesliga for the first time in their history as their super team began to take shape. And then after winning the league, they didn't rest on their laurels either. They invested further in Jürgen Köhler from Juventus, and then they spent big on Heiko Herrlich from Borussia Mönchengladbach. Then Dortmund would win the league for a second time in a row, and this would qualify them for the Champions League. And then in the summer of 96, they would sign Paulo Sousa from Juventus again, and this would be the spine of the team who would lead Dortmund to their crowning moment. In the Bundesliga in the 96-97 season, Dortmund finished third, but it was Europe where things really began to kick off. Similar to the UEFA Cup run earlier in the decade, they went on a run in the Champions League, which saw them reach the final in Munich, where they would face Juventus again, the team that thrashed them 4 years earlier. However, this time Dortmund had plundered half the team and were a much better side. And so two first half goals from Riedel put Dortmund in a comfortable position, before in the second half, Alessandro Del Piero cut the deficit to 1, but homegrown forward Lars Ricken would secure their first and so far only European Cup or Champions League. This success then set a precedent for Dortmund, and they've begun to spend more to chase more success. And this is where things started to go downhill. In 98, they reached the semi-finals of the Champions League, but would lose to Real Madrid. However, they would finish 10th in the league. And so following the poor season, they would spend a significant amount of money to return to the top of the table. And that following year they would finish fourth. But the end of the millennium, it would highlight Dortmund's poor financial decision making. In the summer of 1999, they spent 27 million euros, a stupid amount of money for the time. And most of the signings were quite horrible. This is best seen with Victor Ikepa, who cost 6 million from Monaco and scored only 4 goals. While Freddy Bobic, who was a proven Bundesliga striker with Stuttgart, only scored 23 goals in 80 games for the club. And then to make matters worse, Dortmund would finish 11th and not qualify for Europe. And so the emergence of the Premier League in the latter stages of the 90s then saw key players like Riedel, Freund, they all started to leave as well and head to the Premier League. And so in 2000, Dortmund would spend 14.5 million on Thomas Wierzicki, a young talent from Sparta Prague, as well as a hefty fee on a midfielder from Juventus. And this saw them somewhat recover their form and finish fourth. Then the following summer, they would spend nearly 50 million euros on new signings, with half of it being on Marco Amoroso from Parma, who, for context, is still the 59th most expensive signing in the Bundesliga as of today. And it was 23 years ago, which, considering how much money is thrown around today, shows you how questionable this decision was back in 2001. Luckily for Dortmund, this investment paid off, as in 2002, they overtook Leverkusen on the final day of the season to win their third Bundesliga title. Following this title win, the spending wasn't as significant, but the damage had already been done. The club finished third in 2003, meaning they would have to go through the qualifying rounds of the Champions League. They would then lose to Club Brugge in the qualifying round and then drop down to the UEFA Cup, meaning a significantly less amount of money was coming their way. But then they would only get to the second round of the UEFA Cup before being convincingly dumped by Sochaux after losing 6-2 on aggregate. That same season, Dortmund would finish 6th in the Bundesliga, meaning they would miss out on European football completely. So how would Dortmund fix this? You guessed it, they would spend a large amount of money on more players. And this didn't work, and they finished 7th, missing out on European football once again. And this is where the story reaches its crescendo. So the duo of Nibau and Meyer came in and decided, as I said, on this approach to spend a lot of money to try and make Dortmund a successful team. But their decision-making and spending would cripple the club as we kicked off the new century. And their decision-making was shown in 2000 when they decided they would make Dortmund the first Bundesliga club to be floated on the stock market. This had made the club like the 270 million marks at the time, or the equivalent of £95 million. But most clubs that had floated on the stock market failed, because then that made them a company. Whilst there were other questionable decisions, such as selling the stadium, the Westfalenstadion, to Commerzbank. And this then meant they were renting their own stadium for 15 million a year and were able to buy it back at some point. And with the money that they earn from this, as well as several other questionable decisions, they would aim to improve the stadium ahead of the 2006 World Cup. Most notably improving the corners of the stadium. So if you know, well, there's a Signal Iduna Park, it's the strange looking corners. Then, like when the money started to dry up because of this decision to improve the stadium, they then cut the prices of the shares to make more money, and then they got more money, but most of this money would then be used to pay off debts and other money that they owed to other people. And then the perfect storm occurred. The company that held the TV rights for the Bundesliga in 2002 went bust, meaning the club would be without TV money. And then on top of the finances of the renovations, the other questionable decisions at the money that they owed to other people, and then the poor on-pitch performances, which then mean Dortmund would miss out on European TV money, or prize money as well, would mean the club is now in trouble. And so on the TV crisis, it was called the Kirsch crisis. The media company Kirsch, who owned the TV rights for the Bundesliga at the time, filed for insolvency. The company was 6.5 billion euros in debt and owed the clubs 286 million euros in TV money. And so this resulted in the German government needing to step in to provide a portion of the money to allow the Bundesliga sides to continue to compete and function. And so Kicker had reported that the club had spent over 200 million in the past 3 years and needed to spend more. And Meyer was preparing to get a loan of over 100 million from an investment firm. Bayern would even lend Dortmund some money at that point. Then in the first half of the 2003-04 season, Dortmund would announce that they lost 30 million. In just the first couple of months, they were bleeding cash quickly. And so they began to act as fast as they could, selling the naming rights of the stadium for just 5 million euros, as well as selling several players, as well as the transfer rights to other players, which is now illegal. And then in September 2004, Dortmund issued new shares for the stock market as they looked to make more money, but they only made 25 million. It's worth noting that the duo of Niebaum and Meyer became known as Niemeyer. They revealed that the club had lost 67 million euros and were now in debt of up to 118 million. This resulted in Niebaum resigning, and he would be replaced by Reinhard Raubel, who as the president. And so what's worth noting is this was all based around Dortmund, the company, instead of, it gets confusing. But Raubel had been a part of Dortmund's previous financial problems and helped save the club then as well. But that was a bit more football related, where they had to avoid getting relegated to avoid going bust, and they didn't get relegated, thanks to a relegation playoff win against Fortuna Cologne. But Niebaum's successor as CEO would be a fire safety equipment businessman known as Hans-Joachim Watzke. Meyer would stay for now, as he had to help the new guard clean up the mess that he and Niebaum made, because Meyer was one of the people who had like a good idea of the dodgy deals Dortmund had made. And so this all culminated in like Watzke going around the people who had bought shares in the club being, or whether that be through the stock market or other means, proposing this like recovery plan he had drafted up. And so most of them had said yes, but there was a large group who'd not given their opinion yet. And so he would invite these investors to a meeting at a hotel in Düsseldorf, where the future of the club would be decided. And Watzke presented this recovery plan. Then they voted. Luckily, the investors voted with a 94% majority to keep the club alive. And so on March 14th, 2005, Borussia Dortmund survived, just. Under Watzke, the club would change their ways. They started to buy cheaper players, rely on the youth from their club and their academy, Yuri Sahin, Mario Götze, as well as like cheaper signings like Neven Subotic, Mats Hummels, all this. But what helped Dortmund was the arrival of a manager from Mainz in 2008, who changed the club, how the club was viewed not only in Germany, but the world. In 2011, the plan that Watzke had proposed had been successfully implemented and coincided with yet another successful period at Dortmund, where they won the Bundesliga twice and reached the Champions League final. But in present day, Watzke's image has now been tarnished a slight bit because of some of the stuff he says. Considering the day and age now in football, where the Premier League clubs just spend a lot of money, the power of sponsorships, the amount of money Dortmund has now, they can now afford to push the boundaries a bit more. But with Watzke in charge, they've refused to do that. And Dortmund has become a byword for complacency. And you can see that with most of the way they act. And it's about trying to find that, okay, we've been scarred by this. Okay, I get why they take this approach. But you have to acknowledge that we're never going to close the gap on Bayern if we don't start taking risks again. Like, Dortmund have tried it in the past. Axel Witsel, Emre Can, Niklas Süle, but no success has come with it. And now they're left in kind of like this hole. They seem to be getting out of the hole now, but they're in this hole where, they haven't really had any success. I mean, they made the Champions League final in 2024, and the year before that they lost the league title on the final day. So, like, Dortmund is a byword for complacency and falling short, and they need to change this, and they need to start taking more chances and maybe spending the money a bit more. It's not stop being so frugal. But what this also shows on Bayern is just how well run they are. I mean, Bayern have, just through being consistent, have created this gap on everyone else, and you would need at least a decade of Bayern struggle to close that gap again now on the other Bundesliga side. Because Dortmund nearly spent themselves into oblivion, as we've just seen. Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, Stuttgart, Borussia Mönchengladbach, they've all spent time and Schalke. They've all spent time in the second division. While all this time, Bayern have just continued to consistently be at the top. And now you're reaching the point now where traditional clubs are struggling to keep up with Bayern. And that means these clubs who have investors of some sort, whether that's energy drinks or drugs company, they're able to compete. I mean, away from Dortmund and Bayern, the last two winners of the Bundesliga has been owned by Bayer and Volkswagen. And so, these clubs need to start being a bit more, take more risks, Inherently, German clubs are quite poorly run, as we can see. But you need to stop taking more risks with your spending. Let's take this chance, because as Leverkusen brought in these elderly players and it worked. They brought in these players that could win you the title, and it worked. More of these clubs need to start doing that instead of just adopting this, what is becoming an increasingly boring model of buying players low, selling them high, and you just keep doing that back and forth. That's not what football is. You're generally just a business. You're not even a football club anymore. And you see it with other clubs as well. And so it's time for I'm talking to teams at the top of the Bundesliga to start acting like big teams. Start spending your money and being like, okay, we're going to fight for this title now, and deal with the consequences when it goes. With a team like Dortmund, you can buy. I mean, for example, the sale of Jude Bellingham, you sold him for over 100 million. Just reinvest that, because you then find obviously this. Well, as soon as you buy a young player, you will be able to sell them for profit to a Bundesliga, to a Premier League club. That's more or less a guarantee at this stage. So just start doing that. Take that risk. You can sell this young player, but then you buy all these other finished products and do it. Build a team that can win the league, and not just a team that is ready to pounce on Bayern having a poor season. You have to be able to build a team that is ready to take advantage, or just go for it themselves and not have to rely on Dortmund. Bayern lost to Leverkusen, whatever. You have to take advantage, and Dortmund have the capability to do that. 20 years ago, they weren't as well known internationally. Now they are. They have fans in America, Asia, whatever. You can take this risk, and you can go and be like, okay, we're going to go challenge for the title now, and we're going to really spend for it. And you can assert yourself as, okay, we can now challenge Bayern. But Watzke's leaving as CEO at the end of the season, or at some point this year, but he's going for president, so he's not disappearing. But things need to change if Dortmund actually want to be a successful team going forward. So most of my sources for this video has been Uli Hess's book on Borussia Dortmund, and then the Borussia Dortmund fanzine Schwarz-Gelb, which is good information on the problems that Dortmund encountered in the early 2000s, because this was like a first-hand account. So let me know what you think. Should Dortmund start being a bit more adventurous on their spending? What do you think about the fact that Dortmund nearly spent themselves into oblivion?